Books community series. This one is focusing on discoverability and metadata. My name is Lucy Barnes, and I'm an editor and outreach coordinator at Open Book Publishers. I also help to coordinate the Open Access Books Network. And the Open Access Books Network is hosting the event today. It's a free open network for anyone who's interested in open access books. And it's founded by several organisations, Open, Opera, Scholar-Led and Spark Europe, and coordinated by me, by Tom Mustard, and by Agata Morgan. Agata is also here today. And the purpose basically is to share knowledge about open access books, to share new initiatives, to share information, and to build a community of people who are working in open access book publishing, who are working with open access books, who are interested in open access books for any reason. And we've been running this series of Voices from the OA Books community for the last couple of months almost now. Every sort of 2 weeks we've had a session, and basically the aim, for those of you who've not been to one of these sessions before, is to try and to think about what a Plan S policy that was focused on books could or should look like. So we're expecting that Coalition S will be announcing such a policy by the end of the year, and the hope is that what we do here can perhaps feed into that process and give them a broad sense of the issues that are at play for books specifically, so that it's not something that just comes, you know, it's copied and pasted from journals onto books, but that the specific issues that affect books can be highlighted and raised with them. So each event so far has focused on a different aspect of that potential policy. So we looked at the scope, we thought about issues of quality assurance and transparency, we thought about green OA for books and what that might look like. And today we're going to talk about discoverability and metadata with a final session in 2 weeks' time on rights retention and licensing. So basically the idea is that for the first half, we'll have a discussion with some invited speakers who will be introduced shortly. And that will be recorded. So if you would prefer not to be in the recording, then please turn your camera off. And please feel free, if you've got questions for the speakers as that conversation is going on, just drop them in the chat box and they can be addressed. And then we'll have a break, and then the second half will be about you participating in discussion and making your thoughts and views known, and also note-taking, which is kind of crucial there, because we need to have a record of what was discussed, because the breakout rooms aren't going to be filmed. So anything that you want recorded needs to go in the notes, which we'll explain further near the time. And the recordings and the notes are going to feed into the Spark Europe policy proposal. They're going to kind of synthesize all of these different things. And it's basically going to be a kind of a document, information document, proposal document to Coalition S to help them understand more about the issues that are at play. So the session today is going to break down like this. We're going to have a policy overview and speakers interviews for the first half, as I mentioned. Then we're going to have a short break. Then we're going to have, I'll come back and introduce the breakouts and how they're going to work. Then we'll have the breakout sessions, and then we'll come back in the main room just for a quick poll and a quick wrap up. So I think that's enough from me, and I will hand over to Rupert Gassy to start the session.
So thanks so much, Lucy. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. As Lucy said, this session will be concentrating on metadata and discoverability. I'm really excited with the group of speakers that have agreed to come along and kick off this discussion. So we've got 5 speakers in alphabetical order. Stephanie Dawson, who is one of those people that has done research, I think, in both sciences and humanities. So there's not too many of them, but she's more directly the managing director of Science Open, the research discovery platform, and has been working, I think, in increasingly with publishers to enrich book metadata. And I saw an announcement just the other day that Amsterdam University Press you're working with in increasing their enriching their book metadata as well. So thank you. Jennifer Kemp is the head of partnerships at Crossref, where she's working with members on metadata, improving metadata and discoverability with the members. She also co-chairs the Book Advisory Group and the Metadata 2020 Best Principles and Practice Project. She's also co-authored numerous studies on book supply and distribution channels. So thank you so much. Abel Packer is one of the founders and the director of the Cielo Network, has been instrumental in shaping the development and success of Cielo over the last 20 years. Cielo Books is an important component of that network, and I see that there's over 2,500 titles from that network listed on the DOAB. So thank you so much for joining us, Abel, and it'd be great to hear more about that as well. Vincent van Herven-Huy is the co-director of the non-profit open access book publisher Punctum Books. He's also an active researcher, a philologist and specialist in Old Nubian with a new book out just recently. Well done. He's one of the few people I know who holds 2 PhDs, so I'm mildly jealous, but neither of which I think are in philology. So he's a pretty broad-ranging interests. He's also the co-lead with me on the COPAM work package, developing an open dissemination system and metadata database, open metadata database as part of the COPAM project. So thank you, Vincent. And then last, but nobody would ever call least, Charles Wilkinson, who is the Associate University Librarian for Publishing at University of Michigan, where he manages, amongst other things, the University of Michigan Press, Michigan Publishing Services, and Deep Blue Repository, Research Data Services, and probably a whole list of other things as well that come under his mandate. He, amongst other activities, I think he also co-chairs with you, doesn't he, Jennifer, the Crossref Books Advisory Group, and is co-author of several reports, including one with me. I was happy to tag along with him on ebook supply chains. So thank you, Charles. So those are the introductions. Thank you all very much for joining us. The focus and where we thought we'd sort of begin the discussion was to think about the existing technical requirements for metadata and discoverability within the existing Plan S. So Plan S has discussion. Maybe shall I screen share at this point, just for a second? And of course, I've got too many things open, and so maybe you can see that. I'm hoping you can see that.
Yes.
So the Plan S have got technical requirements clearly designed for journals and articles. I've got the link there to the web page where those can be found. If we if summarizing them very briefly, the technical requirements they've got for the publications could be split up like this. And I've got in red, they've got 2 different types of requirements, what they call mandatory requirements and then highly recommended requirements. So the ones that I've highlighted here in red are mandatory requirements. So we've got mandatory requirements on metadata, that it's high quality, that it's an open format, ideally CC0, that info on coalition funders, coalition S funders is available, that it's got a machine readable license, and that it's open air compliant. They've got requirements about permanent identifiers, the use of PIDs, ideally DOIs for the publications, but also ORCIDs, funder IDs, grant IDs, institution IDs. They've got requirements on full texts, including supplementary text and data, that it be in a machine readable format. They recommend an XML JATS. Clearly that's a journal specific format, but in a machine readable format, that it links to data and code and other research outputs that are available in external repositories, and that's deposited in author designed, designated or centralized OA repositories. They've got requirements on citations, accessibility of the data in a citation format in the Initiative for Open Citations format. And they've got a mandatory requirement on preservation, that it's deposited in some sort of long-term preservation and archiving program. So let me try and unscreen share here. I think what I'd like to do is open the discussion there to our panelists and think about each of these in turn, if you like. Maybe we could put metadata and PIDs together. And Jennifer, I think I'll if you don't mind, I'll pick on you first with your Crossref experience, and thinking about how these types of technical requirements for metadata might transfer across to books, and where you would see some of the issues might be.
Yeah, well, I should say that I think overall, not just with the metadata and PID, but everything you just showed there is a lot. I mean, I think that's asking a lot of journal publishers as well as book publishers, which isn't to say that I think it's the wrong thing to do, but I think just to recognize the work that's involved in that sort of thing. But what jumps out to me there to start with is the phrase high quality, which I fully support, but it's hard to define. So I think that that is certainly open to interpretation. And I think that whatever gets put forth for this particular proposal should probably be a little bit more specific than that.
Yes, no, thank you. I mean, high quality it's an open-ended thing, isn't it? And in books, there are so many different types of metadata formats and structures and requirements. It's hard to know exactly what that is. Except that we've got this open air compliant component that sits in there as well. How does that tie in with the Crossref type submission? Like, would a Crossref submission for a DOI submission satisfy the open air compliance as well?
Well, I mean, the thing to keep in mind, I guess, is that what Crossref requires in the metadata is really fairly minimal, right? It's a low barrier to entry. So, and obviously with books, it's just one of many metadata schema that publishers are working with. So I think that, rather than maybe looking at any one thing, including Crossref, is to kind of consider in the whole what should be, what sort of optimal maybe is the word I would use. And I think probably in a perfect world, from my point of view, we would sort of create this from scratch, even with the extra work involved, rather than looking at what is currently required for journals. I mean, I think that's a useful thing to do, but books alone is just such a big category. How do we define books? Often in these discussions, we tend to gravitate toward monographs, but there's so many other kinds of books that may have their own requirements or just what is best for, a contributed volume, or a reference work is not necessarily going to be the same thing as a monograph. So I guess starting with some definitions might be a useful way to go. And again, maybe just setting aside for the moment requirements of any particular, organization or mandate or anything like that. What is it that the books community, thinks is important for each of those types, I guess, would be my approach, which again, I realize is certainly a longer route to get there.
Charles, did you have any thoughts on, you've done quite a lot on ebook supply chains and thinking about metadata for the ebook supply chains?
No, sorry, go ahead, Rupert.
No. It was a open question.
So I think overall this is all very good, right? I mean, with the metadata and the PIDs, I mean, the book's landscape in general is very, very far behind the journal's landscape, and that's having dangerous effects. And the major danger is that some of the main avenues of humanities scholarship, which are books, are going to be left out of a landscape that is increasingly building tools and that are being used by universities and so on, based on a PID assumption and metadata assumptions. So I think overall this is a really good wake-up call for all of us, and we need to work hard to make sure that we follow these. And it's good to have the requirement here that we do, because otherwise humanities research will suffer, and humanities authors will suffer as well, because they won't get the kind of support from their institutions that the scientists will get. So it's good overall. I think the big challenge is to make sure, first of all, that we reduce the barriers to entry, so we don't create barriers to entry that will discriminate against the book publishers who tend to be on the smaller scale, right? That's really important to preserve that bibliodiversity and not create any barriers to entry that will remove that. And secondly, that we also make sure that the systems that we're required to use are sensitive and to the needs of books and complete. And by complete, I was thinking of several examples. I mean, one being, for example, in funder directories, in Bookland, a lot of the funding is currently coming from libraries. But in many cases, you wouldn't find a library listed as one of the funders. So there's a need to make sure that if we do interact with the systems, they are complete enough for us as book publishers to interact with.
Mm-hmm. And I think you also raise an interesting point there about the funder, because sometimes it's hard to know what bit of the funding is being funded here. Is it the research or is it the publication? And in many of the science articles, it's the same thing, but in the book world, it might be considerably different, and that, you know, two considerably, but also significant investments. Yeah. Abel, could I just, you know, Charles raised the point about the importance of including everybody and inclusiveness, and, you know, clearly a really important aspect is the global diversity of scholarship and publication, and including books in different languages and from different regions. I was just wondering your thoughts about these types of technical requirements and how easy or difficult they have been to satisfy, and how you find them for inclusivity.
Thank you. Okay, this is let's say a challenging for let's say decentralized inclusion. We do have solutions, let's say at the global and regional levels, but the capacity of countries and the capacity of the press to really, let's say, move the publishing of a book to digital context is still far from the desired situation. When we have, of course, the easy solution of put the PDF on the website, which is in some way the first way to adopt the digital publication. But when we move to, let's say, EPUB, and when we move to XML, that is, let's say, big challenge. And we lack, let's say, general knowledge. We lack policies, and we do lack institutional support, which do not have with journals, because the journals are very related to research evaluations, and the books are not so, let's say, important. And so the challenge Cielo is having, for example, is how to disseminate the capacity to adopt, let's say, EPUB and progressively XML, and also to adopt online submission system. So inclusion is, let's say, a problem in the level of the adoption of digital publication, how you do the capacity of the countries and institutions to really move the traditional way to the new way. And when they move to the new way, digital, they carry on many of the, let's say, the practices based on paper.
Mm-hmm. And so to just take one particular example of that, but would the implementation of PIDs in particular, or particular, let's say, DOIs within books, would that be problematic for your community generally to be able to implement those?
Okay, not in the case of the Cielo books, because Cielo books is aligned with, let's say, state of the art, and it is mandatory the attribution of DOI at the chapter level and to the book level. And also we are progressively also demand that the authors has his ORC ID assigned. But as I said, this is not general. There is many difficulties regarding the DOI, even in journals, because there is not still widely recognized that DOI is fundamental for visibility, for to be accessible. And there is also the problem of paying for DOI, because some countries and some institutions, they do have a problem not to pay itself, but to pay in foreign money. So the solution is to find intermediary solution, proxy institution that could solve, first disseminate the need to have DOI, and second, the capacity to pay to Crossref and the other signers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Stephanie, I remember you, at some stage we had a conversation in which you were viewing some concern about some of the PIDs and their actual applicability, especially things like ORCID.
Well, basically, are you thinking about how in ORCID, if how people use it? So if you type your ORCID in to the metadata just by hand, there's so many chances of that actually being corrupted, having a wrong data. So on Science Open, we have we're aggregating content from lots of different places, and we're checking that also with Crossref. In cases where we could get unverified ORCIDs from Crossref, we actually don't anymore add those as authors to the papers, because we were, checking with ORCID, adding John Smith to this paper. People were going, wait, who's this strange co-author? Who's this person who's been added to my paper? So because if there was just a one, number typo in your ORCID, then that can cause big problems. And this is the great thing with DOIs. DOIs are really even more stable than ORCID. So I mean, we like to work with ORCIDs, but you also most of the time wouldn't just type a DOI. I mean, you can also just type a DOI by hand into the reference list of your paper without checking that. And we do see that on Science Open as well, when we analyze a reference list and see, oh, here's a DOI, and we try and go and aggregate that, and we get a wrong we get the wrong paper attached to that. It usually doesn't create as big of an outcry as if you add the wrong author to somebody's paper, but still those using those kinds of PIDs without a kind of verification system behind them for authors can be quite challenging, because if you put in the wrong data, then comes out in some other database somewhere like Science Open, some gobbledygook, and then people have to go and try and clean that data, which is really a big challenge. And I think one of the interesting things, just coming back to this idea of PIDs and I mean, at Science Open, we started very much where we started from the journal with journal records and created a citation network from journal articles. And at some point we're like, okay, we have so many DOIs from books, let's add books into the system. So now we're at 4 million books and book chapters. And so we thought, you know, if we talk to publishers, they could easily be able to provide us that kind of information like XML metadata and a list of DOIs and things like that, because we have so many in our platform. We really realized it's not that widespread in the book publishing community. And when we ask book publishers if they could give us metadata about their book records, they often would like to give us ONYX XML. And just recently realized, I mean, the big issue is that ONYX doesn't have DOIs and stable URLs. None of this information is included in that ONYX record. So now we really have a system where this data set about a book has really no connection to this other data set about the book. And I think that's one of the really big challenges, and also one of the reasons why this PID uptake around DOIs has maybe also not been as widespread as it could be.
Mm-hmm.
Rupert, I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that Abel and Stephanie said, which I think are very important. One is, so Abel was referring to PDFs as being a very standard format. And of course, one of the reasons in books that that's the case is that print is still very important, which is very, very unlike journals. And so the reason that we have standards like ONYX and ISBNs, which are not mentioned at all here, is that they are fundamentally book supply chain identifiers for managing the distribution of print, and have been later used for electronic. And so since, you know, it's still the case that many book publishers are primarily print publishers, and that would be true even in places like the US, and certainly true of countries like Greece or Spain. That's a problem. And not acknowledging those identifier schemes is a problem, because it's a whole extra level of identification management that book publishers are having to get their heads around, in addition to all these electronic identifiers. So I think that's one thing. The other thing that Stephanie mentioned is just how messy some of these sources are, even in the world of journals. So although I'm not endorsing any Kent Anderson points of view, he has written very interestingly about just how messed up ORCID is as a database, and how incredibly messy it is. And then part of that is because ORCID has been very, very resistant to working with libraries, to allow libraries to proxy create records, and are assuming that scholars themselves are creating and populating ORCID metadata in a responsible way, which of course they're not, because they don't really have the time to do that, and they're not particularly interested in it. So just 2 points. The print overlay is really important in Bookland, and some of these crucial bits of the infrastructure that Plan S is relying on are kind of messy and need to be invested in to clean them up.
And Jennifer, go.
Yeah. Sorry, my heart skipped a beat when Stephanie mentioned hand keying in DOIs, but I know that happens. So yeah, also just to pick up on a couple of things, the PIDs discussion is always interesting, because for us at Crossref, it's really it's so much more about the metadata that's associated with the PIDs, right? Not to, you know, discount the importance of ORCIDs or anything else, but what I see a lot, and I don't know, I mean, Charles and I work together in this books group, so he may have a different view of it, but what I see are book publishers that really, really, really want to do more, and are unable to for one reason or another. So they want to include orchids, for example. They want to include references or citations, and that's one of the items that's mentioned on this list, but that's always been problematic for book publishers as well, just being able to extract references and the volume of them and things like that. So again, obviously, I think the PIDs are very important. But for us, we have a lot of book records. It's books and the associate, books and chapters have long been one of our fastest growing content types, but the records themselves tend not to be very rich, which is why I sort of, the high quality phrase caught my attention earlier, because, having them is a big step and it's important for discoverability, but then getting, more information associated with them is really, what I see as key.
Mm-hmm. Vincent, I would just bring in if you've got any thoughts, but also I just wondered, another part of this was that the metadata was going to be open. And one of the things that strikes me in much of the book supply chain is that metadata is not open. And so I just throw it out if you had any thoughts, how is this going to be a problematic part for the book industry, or is this openness is
it ties in what Charles remarked, is namely that a lot of our practices are tied in with print. And I guess one of the effects of that is that a lot of our metadata, in whichever form they are stored, are not open at all. And actually to propose CC0 licensed metadata throughout is actually quite a radical proposal, which immediately comes up against, for example, a major metadata supplier such as OCLC, whose metadata are not CC0. And so what does that mean, right? If we all move over to CC0 licensed metadata in order to be Plan S compliant, then that clashes immediately with the interests of OCLC, from which libraries get their metadata to a large extent. So, and other suppliers like OCLC. So this then creates a potential conflict. I am fully in favor of CC0 licensing, but that doesn't mean that wanting it means that the entire book industry and every single actor in it can immediately switch over their, well, in case of those vendors, their business models, in fact. Like for a publisher, this is a relatively easy thing to do, to make the records freely available. For people who make money on having these records monetizable, obviously this is a bit of a problem. What I also would like to comment on is something that Eyal said, is like, all of these tools should not create additional thresholds. And it has been my impression that the demand for ORCID, the demand for DOI, the demand for most of these PIDs, in one way or the other, incurs costs for publishers, either because you will have to adopt certain software packages, or simply because you have to have new subscriptions or alliances that all cost money. If not money, they cost a lot of time to manage and to maintain. This, I fear, is really excluding many of the non-English, non-global North publishing houses. Not in the least also because most of the language of metadata is English, including the tagging of metadata themselves, which I think is problematic. And I'm really fearful that imposing these, even minimal norms, in fact, exacerbates divides and chasms in the book publishing industry that I think already the shift from print to digital has created. And I think we should do everything in our power to make sure that whatever is implemented or suggested does not further threaten any semblance of equity, which I think is long gone in any case. Like the fact that you would have to pay for DOI, I think is unacceptable. It's utterly unacceptable that you have to pay for DOI.
So just picking up and thinking for the panel as a whole, at present, the sort of the implication is that the publisher should bear the cost of doing all of this, and that you can put down the mandate and leave it to the publishers to implement the mandate. So picking up on what you've just said, Vincent, do you think that, Plan S should be in a position where they were supporting and potentially helping with the provision of infrastructure to support the creation of metadata that would satisfy these requirements for books that are being funded through their route, so that they were, helping to support that framework if they see that as being important, rather than just saying, leave it to the publisher to do it?
I mean, it definitely, I think if you put these requirements in place, and not only for books, also actually for journals, you should actively fund open infrastructure that facilitates this in a way such that, even the smallest publisher is able to comply with them. Absolutely. You should put your money where your mouth is. Like, if you're just creating some rules that only publishers in rich countries can with actually, I mean, even when I talk about punks and books, with difficulty reach those standards, then you're simply creating inequitable systems, and I don't find it acceptable.
Rupert, can I just say, I mean, in terms of investment, I think a very missing part, I think a missing entity in this area is the national libraries. So with books, I mean, we spend a lot of time, certainly in the US, preparing book materials for Library of Congress, and the cataloging in cataloging process activities, and then the deposit of copyright copies. I mean, that's an awful lot of effort that we're putting in, and to be honest, we're getting very little back. So those, and I know Library of Congress has tried to improve that, but that's a very obvious place to do a lot of enrichment of metadata, or if not enrichment, at least version of recording, right? And so that's an interesting space that seems to be kind of left out of this, because it's so crucial for books, and it extends right through to areas like preservation.
But I mean, for example, LOC classification is a closed standard. It's copyrighted. We cannot, I mean, even if you want to have CC0 licensed metadata, you cannot technically even use their classification. Like, what does this even mean? Like, many of the PIDs for funders, for subject categories, these are copyrighted systems. Like, there are very few. I think THEMA is the only one that actually has an explicit open license on it. BIC, BISAG, BISAC, all of these are closed and proprietary. Like, how can we talk about having CC0 licensed metadata, which I'm fully in favor of, when the PIDs that we're supposed to use in order to actually provide these high quality, rich metadata, most of them are copyrighted. I mean, I think this is a serious issue. Why are we still using those? Why are we not forcing those institutions to actually release these classification schemes, CC0, first, before we start using them?
Okay, just moving on, looking at the time, and I'm presuming that I'm going to get a message from Lucy shortly saying we got it.
Rupert, you already got one from me. If you look into your chat, you will see there is already a message from me.
Okay, so we have to shut up now, do we? Or can I ask one more question?
We have 10 more minutes. 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes. Okay, thank you. Yeah, here we go. So, we mentioned full text, and I know that's problematic, so problematic that I'm thinking I just might move. We've already heard Abel saying that, PDFs might be as good as we could hope for, and anything more than that looks a big ask. I was sort of thinking of jumping over and thinking about citations and preservation. Citations data, is that realistic to be able to get out of books and see that as a mandate that the citations are going to be there at the book and presumably at the chapter level? Maybe there's my first stab. Is citations, can that be part of a mandate as well to put citations? Charles, what do you think? Or Abel, you're
I'll let Abel go first.
Okay. Okay, one of the reasons, motivations we established when we created Share Books was to have, let's say, a kind of a bibliometric system to give minimum evaluation of books in terms of citations. We do have a control of the downloads, but we never succeed really to establish a system to measure, let's say, performance based on citation for many reasons. The first reason is that we, except for public health and some social sciences area, we never got enough collection to be representative of a given area and say, okay, the performance is likely. So what we do is specific studies on citations when we needed it or when researchers needed it. We usually use or get the citations using, for example, Plumex system that goes through the full text and extract the citations, which we can download and do basic processing. Citations is important in of books, is important in journals also. For example, in the case of Cielo, social sciences or human sciences and humanities, 45 in average, 45 of the citations are to books. Of course, a lot of citations to Freud, to Darwin and so on, but there are also citations to recent books, okay? So that is something that is important in the case of Cielo also, to look about the conversation in the area, because we think that if journals in social sciences cite 45% of books, it is not fair for you to evaluate journals based on journal citations only.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Charles, you were also going to...
Yeah, well, just to say that this bit about the citations is the bit that freaks me out a bit, because we're not able to do that yet. And I know we should be doing it because it's meant to be part of being a member of Crossref, even if there's some allowance for book publishers. But it's just, you know, in so much of the journals literature, there are vendors working behind the scenes to do almost all this work. For books where we're doing things ourselves, this is a bit of our workflow that we haven't got our heads around at all. So this is a bit painful. I don't know, Rupert, if open book publishers, if you've got your heads around how to do this citation deposit.
So we do strip out the citations, the text and the DOIs when we have them, and then deposit them through to Crossref. But in a lot of cases, there's no DOIs to them, and so we get a huge number of I can't remember what the return is, Jennifer, you'll know better than me, but where it's sort of a textual, it's a sort of open text rather than being assigned to a particular publication, because there's no record in the database for that. So this is sort of a text assignment, which is always a bit loose. But Jennifer, you'll be much better versed at what it is I'm trying to say there.
No, I think you said it very well. And I think Stephanie has a comment that's probably relevant here.
I think it's also important in the workflow. A lot of times authors are working with databases to create their reference lists. So they're using Mendeley, they're using Zotero, but then what they do is they export that in APA format as text only and send you that as part of their manuscript. So they have rich data with DOIs, everything tagged, everything that you would need actually. But our current sort of paper-based workflows actually require them to strip all of that out, make a text file that then typesetters in journals, most of the time typesetters are then going back, feeding those in to doing a query at Crossref, seeing if they can find those DOIs that the author has in their own database. So actually thinking about communicating that with authors and trying to get the authors to deliver that data that you can then put directly into your Crossref records, I think is maybe one thing, one way to start tackling that problem, because I really do think that there are more DOIs out there that authors are using that actually then end up in the reference list.
Yeah, my heart also skips a beat when somebody mentions stripping out metadata, but of course that happens an awful lot. So I just one other quick comment on that, I guess, is that we're talking about all of this very reasonably in terms of workflows and supply chain and requirements and all of that. But I guess from my point of view, I think of it as what is best for discoverability. And I think, as we've discussed, there's some sort of tension between what would help with discoverability and what puts, a burden on publishers that might be, too much of that burden. But I guess, ideally, I would think we could propose something that would include, a set of requirements or recommendations that is not unduly burdensome and still, maximizes discoverability.
I guess I've also got this scratching fear that, not all publishers, book publishers, are really wanting to embrace discoverability, especially of OA content, because they're scared that it might cannibalize on their sales. And so, there are some publishers one can think of that, have an OA title, but it's buried away somewhere and completely undiscoverable, quite deliberately. And so, to what extent does a mandate like this need to come in to say, listen, you really do need to make this work discoverable, and what are the standards rather than to prevent discoverability, which some publishers might be inclined to want to do.
So national libraries is one group that I think is missing, but another group is the systems providers, because I think one of the big differences from journals is that the book publishers don't tend to use submission systems in quite the same way. I mean, at the acquisitions point, things are coming in through email attachments and so on, and this comes back to Stephanie's point. There's no kind of way to systematize how an author deposits stuff in most book publishers, which is so different from the journal's literature, where even the smallest journal now will have some form of peer review submission management software at work. But then the other thing is, when you get to a certain scale as a book publisher, you tend to have invested in an integrated title management system. And there are these large suppliers, Firebrand and Kloppertech and so on. And most publishers with over 100 books a year will have invested in one of those. And it's actually because it's a mixture of a project management system and a metadata discovery system, metadata minting system. So THOF is a great initiative. It is fundamentally a metadata minting system at this point. It doesn't have that project management component. So, it is very problematic if you look at systems like Firebrand, that they are almost entirely geared to the print world. And so there aren't native fields for things like an ORCID. There aren't native fields for things like a RAW. That's a problem. So that's another characteristic of the book supply chain. I think we need to put pressure on those suppliers to make it much easier for us as book publishers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you all very much. Does anybody have any final things they'd like to say, or if anybody's got a question that I should have asked or wish to ask quickly before we wrap this up, then please throw it in the chat. Vincent.
Yeah, well, maybe to follow up on what Charles says, we should have these people at our table here. It's actually, they are the ones who are always missing, namely the ones that provide our software, that provide large parts of our supply chain infrastructure, that are never there. And I don't know why. Maybe we're not inviting them, maybe it's not interesting for them, but somehow they should be involved in this conversation, because indeed, many of the systems in place prohibits actually the smooth implementation of what is proposed through Plan S.
Good point. We should be reaching out and engaging. I'll take the blame for not having invited them to this panel.
This is a systematic problem.
Yeah. Okay. And unless anybody else has got anything else, thank you all very much for that very insightful discussion and conversation. Lucy, are you, or Agata is probably going to tell us what we have to do next. So thank you
all. Lucy, do you want to go ahead, or?
Yeah, basically everyone has until 3 o'clock UK time, 4 o'clock European time to go and have a coffee or stretch your legs or whatever, and then we'll come back for the breakout discussion. Just come back from the break and then we'll kick off the breakout session. Okay, I reckon we can probably get started again. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you all have recaffeinated and are ready for some discussions. The next half of the session is going to be discussion based in breakout rooms. So I'm just going to run through quickly how that's going to work, and then we'll kick off those discussions. So basically, the purpose of the breakout sessions is to discuss and record your views on the scope of the Plan S policy as regards metadata and discovery. Obviously, we've heard some discussions in the first part, and now it's the opportunity for everybody to have their say. So that'll be a combination of discussion, but also note-taking. So I just want to emphasize that it is important to take notes of your discussions, because we're not going to be recording them. So the notes are the only record of the amazing, brilliant things you came up with. So the completed notes are going to be held publicly on the Open Access Books Network, where we've got the notes and the recordings from previous sessions as well, so that they're going to be open to view by the rest of the community. And there'll also be an open notepad there for anyone that wants to add further thoughts, either anyone that couldn't be here today or people that have been here and then have thought of more things they wanted to add. And the idea is that all of these different materials, the notes, the recordings and everything, will feed into a policy document, an information document that will be created by Spark Europe and that will be presented to Coalition S. So Toby is going to kick off the breakout room sessions for us shortly. There'll be about 7 people in each breakout room, and there'll be a collaborative Google Doc for you to put your notes on. So if someone could drop that in the chat. Yes, fantastic. Thanks, Agatha. So basically the document in the chat is a kind of index. You'll see their notes for each different breakout room, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And when you're transported to your breakout room by Toby, you'll see some kind of notification on your screen that tells you which breakout room you're being sent to. So that's the number notepad that you need to use to take your notes. We suggest that you nominate a note taker, or that you agree among yourselves that you'll all contribute notes to make sure that the discussions are recorded. And don't wait, by the way, for anyone to appear to start the discussion. Just once everybody's there, you can kick it off yourselves. And please just note down who is in the room as well, because that's helpful for us to know, just so that it's not a mass of anonymous feedback, that we know roughly, who was there and what the background of the people there were and what viewpoint they're coming from. If you can come to a consensus on the questions that you'll see in the Google Doc, then that's great. If you can't, that's fine. Just explore the areas of disagreement and note those down. And the session leaders and facilitators will be dropping in. So there's me, there's Agatha, there's Tom Grady, and we'll all be kind of moving between the rooms as we have on previous sessions, just to make sure that everyone's okay. You've all got your notepads, no technical issues, everything's going fine. And if your connection drops for any reason, just come back to the call via the link that you used to access the call in the first place, and Toby will resend you to your breakout room. So I think Agatha's already shared the link to the Google Docs. So that is everything. Hopefully that's all clear. And I think, Toby, you can do your magic now, if you wouldn't mind.
Just one question about the duration of the breakout rooms. 40 minutes, 45?
I think it'll be 45.
Okay. All right, then I'll whisk you away right now.
So what was that?
It feels like we were pulled out of a dream.
This isn't Texas anymore.
I was going back to the scene in Dallas where Bobby Ewing comes out the shower.
Yeah.
Showing my age.
Okay, Toby, is everyone back? Because I would like to run my poll.
Yep, looks like it. Rooms are closed.
Great. So welcome back. I hope you had really good discussions. As usually, we cannot actually ask every one of you how it was and what were the main takeaways from your breakout rooms, because we just simply have too many people here. But we did prepare a very straightforward poll question for you. So I will launch it right now, and then I would ask you to answer. So the question is quite simple. So which of the following technical requirements should the Plan S for books include? And you have open metadata, use of PIDs, full machine readable text, citations data, deposit in long-term preservation, and self-archiving services. So go ahead, you can choose more than one. You can also not choose any of them if that's your preference. Quite curious. I will let it run for another 30 seconds, and then we'll share the results with you. Okay, I'm ending it now, and I'm sharing the results with you. So we have a clear winner. So we have 100% for the use of PIDs, 87 for open metadata, 73 for preservation, and then 37 for full machine readable text, and last place goes to citations data. Quite interesting. Rupert, would you like to comment on these results?
Not really. Yeah, no, as you say, sort of, yeah, interesting. I saw the comment in, you know, it would be nice if there is an it depends, isn't there? I mean, certainly one of the things that came up in our work thing and was Charles's as well and things is, you know, to what extent can you expect everybody to be able to do all these things, and to what extent can Plan S help in getting them to achieve, even on the use of PIDs? But yeah, very interesting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. And now I think over to Lucy, right? Where's Lucy? Ah,
I'm here.
good. Okay.
I'm hopefully sharing a final set of slides.
You are.
Excellent. So yeah, so just thank you, everyone. Thanks to our speakers and to everyone who attended and who took part. I'm just going to wrap up now briefly to remind you what happens now. So the notes and recording from today will be shared with the notes and recordings from the previous sessions and also from the final session in 2 weeks' time via that link on the Humanities Commons site of the OABN. And there'll also be an additional doc there which will be open for more comments. So if you want to add more thoughts, if people who haven't attended but have engaged with the recording and with the notes want to add notes there, they can. So that's going to be there. And then just a last plug for the OABN. We run various different events. At the moment, we're focusing on these sessions, but once these are finished, we'll be back to our bookmark sessions. We have a Humanities Commons site, which has discussion boards, an event calendar, various different reports and documents that are related to open access books, which are uploaded there. We've got a mailing list where we tell you about the events and send the recordings. And we've got a Twitter account as well, where we try and share as much as we can about what's going on with open access books. So that's just a plug really to check that out if you haven't, and to see what's going on there. That's everything, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. And maybe we should also mention that the next session is in 2 weeks. Sorry, I was about to say next week, but
yeah, 2 weeks. Rights retention and licensing is the last session, and that's in 2 weeks' time. And I think probably we'll see various people who are here also there, and I hope you do.
Absolutely. Good. Okay. Is there anything else that anybody would like to add at this point? I don't know if Rupert, you would like to say some words of wisdom to close the session or not?
I don't think I've ever been expected to do that. So, but thank you all so much, indeed, and especially the speakers at the start as well. Thanks so much for your contributions, and thanks everybody, and also all the backroom team. As all of them will know, is I completely relied on every single one of them. So thanks, Agatha and Lucy and Toby and everybody who was behind the scenes driving this, Tom as well. Okay, cheers.
Thank you, and hopefully see you all in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye-bye.